Hello, and welcome to episode 105, the Power Score LSAT podcast. This is John Dinning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kalorn in Napa Valley.
Yes, sir. Happy almost St. Patrick's Day to you, my friend.
One of my very favorite holidays. It's the night before, so we obviously are already in the festive spirit.
That's right, yeah, St. Patty's Eve. So I bet they can at least guess some of what we're drinking.
We better have an Irish theme or we're getting kicked out of the Irish fan club.
Yes, that's right. Unofficial Irish fan club. So hit me with it. What do you got?
I don't know if I'm unofficial Irish. I do have an Irish heritage.
I mean, I do too, but at some point you got to just stop claiming it.
No, mine's better.
You have a town with your surname in Ireland, as I understand it. So
that is correct. There is also a pub in that area that is the family pub from way back, apparently. I'm one place in the world that I'm sure that I can get free drinks without trying too hard. Yes, indeed. But I am having Guinness because that is the classic drink to me, and I love Guinness. And so it was a simple call. What about you?
Yeah, honestly, I flirted with Guinness and went with something slightly stronger, partly because I'm just falling asleep. And so to wake me up, I went with an Irish coffee. So heavy on the espresso side, but also heavy on Jameson.
Jameson.
In fact, a little trivia to foreshadow what's to come. I poured a shot of Jameson in this for every single test form that we saw over the last weekend.
Which, based upon some past tests that we've recapped, could mean that you're on your way to the hospital eventually.
That's a death sentence.
Not this time.
Yeah, there's an Irish wake in my funeral. In my future. No, not this time, as we'll see. I'm still safe and sound by that metric.
Yeah, but Guinness and Jameson, I think, really the twin pillars of the Irish society as far as drinking. So we've got them both covered. I feel good about us.
I think even without as far as drinking, maybe just the twin pillars.
Now, you've selected the song here, also in the Irish theme. Tell me about that.
I did. I kicked around a few of the old Irish standards, The Parting Glass and things like that. But I went with something slightly more contemporary by a band called Flogging Molly. And in a tradition that I think suits the podcast itself. It's a song called Drunken Lullabies. And we'll put a link to it. If you've never heard it, it's a good sort of, fire up, pour a Guinness kind of song.
When I used to live in D.C., there was a pub there called the 4 Ps that wasn't all that far from where I lived. Used to wander up there a lot, and it was always the traditional Irish music playing. A lot of good Irish pubs in D.C. that have the fiddle playing. You drink some beers, meet some cool people. I miss that.
Yeah, I bet they're getting rowdy right about now. It's almost sunset here, so if that was an East Coast thing, I'm sure they're well into the cups.
Yeah, we don't have that so much in Napa Valley, so I'm missing out.
Fair enough. So that's tunes, that's cocktails. Let's talk about the LSAT World.
Let's do that. So we just had the March LSAT largely run through. There still is one more testing day coming up, and that is for the makeup testers. Mm-hmm. That's coming up, if I recall, on Wednesday, March 23rd. So if you ran into any problems in your test, if you weren't able to take it, you got knocked out early through no fault of your own, they will have you take another test. It will be different than the test that we're talking about today and recapping. So unfortunately for you, this does not give you an advantage there. You'll get something entirely different, and that's because there's such a long distance of time between the main administration and then this makeup administration. After that, we go to score release for this test, which I think is the 30th.
It is.
And then we roll into the next LSAT eventually, which is April's LSAT. Mm-hmm. And that actually comes up at the end of April. It's the 29th and 30th right now. And if I recall right now, as we're recording this podcast, at some point, the registration deadline for that April test will pass. So by the time this comes out, April will be closed down.
Yeah, if you're listening to this, you missed the window. But as we're doing this, there's about 4 hours left tonight on the 16th.
So sending out mental vibes across the world, if you need to take that test, you can register now. Yeah. I actually tweeted it earlier. So
I think I retweeted you or somebody. But telepathic hurry up. But if you're listening to this, you missed it. I do hope people got signed up for that, though, because what we've seen so far with the test this year, and we'll obviously elaborate on it, is they're going pretty well. Yeah. So I think April's a really great opportunity for a lot of reasons that we've discussed before.
Yeah, mostly when you say going well, the number of problems that we've seen on these recent small tests is way down on an overall basis. Yeah. We'll still talk about it a little bit, but they're not having some of the major problems we saw with the huge administrations last year and even the year before.
Yeah, that's precisely what I meant. These small tests seem to be pretty smooth sailing. So the
Yeah.
April scores come out May 18th, which is a Wednesday. And then we get a little bit of a break. May is the first month of the year off from testing.
Finally.
Hallelujah. But then June, we're back in the saddle. The June test is on June 10th and 11th, another Friday, Saturday test. Registration for that's not until the end of April, April 27th. So there's some time for June folks to make a decision and commit. And then that test releases on June 30th, which is a Thursday, very end of the month.
Yeah, and right now that June test is on Friday and Saturday. That should be a bigger test than any of these last few here, this February, March, or April run. So they may add a Sunday day to that as well, but they won't do that until we get closer and we start to see the registration numbers pump up a little bit. Right now, they're still relatively low. And so the new kind of like protocol is schedule it for Friday, Saturday, wait and see what happens thereafter. That gives you the opportunity to add Sunday and then also to add Tuesday if they want, if we get a really big administration eventually.
Yeah. Which I think we will, but so far it's been pretty small.
Certainly has.
Yeah.
And then we got some seminars kind of like sprinkled throughout this LSAT testing schedule. We got a comparative reading webinar coming up on the 30th of March that is free. So if you get scores back and you're like, all right, I gotta take the LSAT again. We hope that's not the case, but if you do, that is a webinar you can attend. And if you're still in the process and you're just kind of listening to see what these LSATs are like when we recap them, that's floating out there. There's also a circular games webinar on April 13th. And then we'll go back to the beginning and do an LSAT 101 on April 26th. But you can go to our website at powerscore.com/free seminars is one big word and see all the free webinars that we have coming up. We rotate through a whole host of topics in all the different subject matters and broad discussions as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting trifecta you just ran through. Comparative reading has been, for a lot of people, the hardest reading passage set on recent tests. Circular games are obviously extremely rare, but critical if you happen to see one to know what you're doing. And then LSAT 101, I think for anybody just getting started or in the early stages, man, there's a wealth of good information to help steer you right in the early days in that one. So kind of covering all bases with the next three.
Yeah, and speaking of webinars, one of the questions that we've been getting a lot recently is there going to be a crystal ball for April, and is there going to be a crystal ball for June? You want to address that question?
I got asked if there was going to be a crystal ball for the makeup test next week. So
that's right. No, that's a solid no.
Demand is high. Supply is low.
Fleeting.
Well, good news for both if you're looking at April and June. The one we just did prior to March will stay alive in our online student centers, both the recording of that and the recommended problem sets for April. We really built that one and designed it to be a 2-test look ahead. So we'll talk a little bit about how well it applied to the March test as we go, but we expect that to hold true for April. Nothing in March makes me think we need to redo it or amend anything, which is good news.
Agreed.
I do think, however, that we're going to do another one for June.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, we'll probably set a date relatively soon here. There's some calendar things I have to take a look at. I'm hoping to actually do some traveling in May, but we'll have to wait to see. Oh, finally. Really like to get out of here. Just for, more than a day or two. We'll have to see about that, but we will put that on the calendar relatively soon, and it's going to run exactly the same way the recent ones have run. We will do it free to the public. We will do it for one night only. There will not be a recording sent to everybody, and instead we will post the recording, but we will only post it for PowerScore students. So you'd have to be in a course or analytics or what have you to actually get access to that afterwards. But we will circle back to some of the crystal ball things we talked about, because I think this is where the nuance of what we do gets lost sometimes. There are parts of what we talked about that actually occurred, and there are other parts that we think will occur next time.
Yeah, in April.
So we'll have to wait and see, but we'll talk a little bit more about that and come in behind some of the information about this test. So let's move forward.
Let's do it. Let's get down to the March test then. First thing is, you mentioned the score release already, but just to reiterate, it's Wednesday, March 30th, and it starts at 9 a.m. And by starts, it just kind of happens at 9 a.m. If you have a writing sample that's been approved and no issues came up with your test itself or get flagged for review, you will get your score right around 9. Might be 8:50, it might be 9:03, but roughly 9 Eastern, you'll get an email and your LSAT org account will update. And that holds
Yeah,
for the
and
makeup testers too.
exactly. So even if you took it on March 23rd, a week later, you will get your scores with everybody else, which of course, once again, proves the fact that it doesn't take that long to process LSAT results and have them ready to go. They've built themselves in a nice cushion so that they're not pressured. That's not the reality of what's required, though. It's sufficient to make them happy, but it's not necessary to make them happy.
Look at you getting conditional.
Ah, yes. And then thereafter, if you did need to sign up for another LSAT, June would be your next option. And that registration, as John mentioned earlier, is April 27th. So circling back to the March LSAT, what actually happened? Let's run through the testing days that we saw.
Sure.
Let's kind of go through the three main testing days that we've already seen, two of which were far more voluminous and important in certain respects as far as the numbers than was the other one. So the first day was Friday, March 11th. And last time we did a podcast, you were like, oh, that's a special day. Yes, that was my birthday. So I worked on my birthday all day and I was not happy about it. But that's what you got to do sometimes. I think there was around 3,500 people registered, and it looks like the actual number of test takers was around 3,000. That's incredibly small when you really get down to it. So that was a very small testing group. We didn't see a whole lot of problems. There were some complaints. People had issues. I saw late proctors. I saw disconnections, but then nothing widespread that occurred in there. The next test day was Saturday, March 12th, and I had a hangover for the early part of that test day, but I was still working, started working both days at like a little after 4 a.m., so I felt like I really put in a full effort. That was a bigger test by registration, which is unsurprising. It's Saturday, fewer people had to work. It's about 4,000 people registered for that, and I think the actual number was around 3,500, give or take 100 or so that were in there. And then for most people, they're like, that's it, the test is over. But there are a group of test takers, usually 100 or 200 that take the test on Tuesday. And so we had that on Tuesday, March 15th. And those are largely the paper and pencil test takers. So they're under different proctoring kind of environment, the different protocols to their tests because they're in a slightly different format. And those test takers essentially have a lot of similarities in their exam to the people who had it on Friday or Saturday, which we'll come back to. But there's, say, 100 of those. You add it all up, you might have had 6,600 people take this test, 6,500 people maybe. That is a super small test on the historical kind of pattern line.
I made the comment back in February that I thought it was probably the smallest test in history. And now we have a new record holder because this is about 1,000 people smaller still.
Yeah, I told one of my friends at LSAC, I was like, don't do this again. First off, don't do it on my birthday. I'm mad about that. I know you did that on purpose. And then secondly, if there's only 6,000 plus, just put it inside the prior test or the after test. Do February or April and not have a test this small. Because the truth is, John, no matter how many people take the test, the work that we have to do is exactly the same.
Yeah, that's a perfectly selfish request. But I stand, I stand 100% behind it. Anyone listening to this is like, screw you guys. I needed March. I'm glad I got to take it. There's 6,500 people who would be mad at you for saying that.
Yeah. I mean, realistically, we're joking around about how all of this works and so forth. And I like talking to LSAT students. I like being able to track these LSATs. So I really don't care when it is. I'll show up if they're having it. I just was like, could we not do it on the 11th?
It's a little much for us. The more charitable side of me almost wishes they'd run it like the GRE, where you pick your date, schedule it 4 or 5 days a week. But I don't think we're anywhere near that. I don't see that in the future anyway. So, yeah, I don't think they're going to do a March test next year. In fact, I'm certain they're not. So next year will be Jan, Feb, April. But
and if they went to that GRE format, we wouldn't be able to recap these tests this way. And even the crystal balls would take on a very different tone because they'd be more generalized. So as far as technical issues, we mentioned before, there weren't that many. However, we always say that this kind of disclaimer about how this works. The fact that there were fewer problems is meaningless if you were one of the people affected. I talked to several students who had issues, and for them, it's devastating. And it's confusing. It's not an easy process. You have to act like you're canceling your score and that you were canceling it in order to make this complaint when in fact you had nothing to do with the cancellation. You just couldn't take your test. There's all sorts of issues. But the one thing that I will say is these smaller tests that we've had so far have resulted in largely relatively smooth operations throughout each test day. We haven't seen some of the huge systemic problems that we had, whether it was pop-ups or really a widespread lockout of test takers last fall. So that's good. For the majority of people, it's a great thing. For those of you who get affected by a problem, none of this matters. It still is terrible. It still sucks. And we still have a lot of sympathy for you. And that's why we always say, advocate for yourself, make the complaint, ask to get, the retake, make sure nothing goes on your record. There are steps that you can take by talking to supervisors at LSAC. And if you've been wronged, especially by a technical problem beyond your control, you have every right to demand a retake. Now, if you get knocked out of the test 30 seconds from the end, they're not going to give you a retake. But if you're in the middle of section 2 and the proctor disconnects your test section for some reason or takes control of your computer for 8 minutes, guess what? You're going to get a retake, and there is justice and proof for that.
Yeah.
So advocate for yourself, demand that for that, and they will ultimately give it to you.
Yeah, you may have to insist upon it a few times. You may have to escalate your claim up past whoever answers your first phone call. But it is available to you, and again, you will qualify if you're in some of the situations Dave just described. What's interesting to me here is, we can say that 2022 has been largely smooth sailing, especially compared to how last year ended. And I wonder if it's because they're beginning to actually smooth out the process itself, or if this is purely just a factor of small testing size, small groups.
Maybe both.
I'm sure they're both contributing a little bit. I wonder what happens when June and then later tests this year start to pick back up into 20,000+ people.
I mean, the two biggest issues that we tend to run into when talking to students is, number one, the proctor did something invasive or disruptive. Started saying they couldn't see your face, wanted you to move your chair. And you can say, well, maybe you contributed by moving your head or talking out loud. But a lot of times what happens is the proctor will do something along the lines of they'll start talking to you out of the blue without pausing the clock. They'll take over control of your mouse to make adjustments without stopping the clock. And so to me, that's a proctor education process. The proctors need to be told, if you want to stop or interrupt LSAT takers, the first thing you do is you pause their test. Because that takes all the pressure off. Because otherwise, test takers are sitting there watching the clock run down, and that is a certifiably maddening situation. It will really upset somebody, and understandably so. So that's the first thing that we see. The second thing that we see are connection issues. And I know exactly what it says. Oh, your Wi-Fi or your connection isn't strong enough. And I've gone publicly on record before saying I think those kind of disclaimers are utter BS. And the reason I feel that way is that I have had students take this test from inside the law firms they worked at. And we're talking like top 10 law firms with the most robust, powerful internet connections you can possibly imagine. And yet they're like, your connection is weak. I personally think it has a lot to do with the proctor use servers being overloaded. Now, sure, there are some people on there who are trying to do this test on Wi-Fi. And yes, we have seen this repeatedly. People on Wi-Fi will have more problems than somebody with a landline. And so the harder the connection that you can get, the more direct, the better off that you're going to be. But both of those issues are the ones that when volume scales, you're going to see more problems. You're going to have less experienced proctors. You're going to have more bandwidth usage. That's going to contribute to both of those problems, I would say.
Yeah, I agree.
I didn't mean to go on a long soliloquy about that, but...
Well, I mentioned this actually in the crystal ball when we were doing it. One of the things I love about this time of year is the overlap that you get between people at the very end of their cycles who know a lot about this, the testing experience, how everything works, what you and I tend to say, and people that are brand new to it. We're getting a lot of people right now that are just starting their cycles. That's why we're running an LSAT 101 webinar next month. It's for those people. So I'm not sure there's anything you can say right now that's not going to hold some value for a decent size in the market.
Yeah, and when we get to that next crystal ball, at least for the June, and it's already in the March, April one of the things that you talked about was talking to your proctor before the test starts in order to lay out some ground rules.
Yes.
And sometimes they switch proctors in the middle of these exams, and you don't even know until someone's new voice says something to you. But there are steps that you can take. You should really try to kind of soak up all the learning that you can when you've got people who can actually talk about this knowledgeably. And speaking of a knowledgeable discussion, let's get into the domestic March 2022 LSAT, which is going to be a shorter conversation than usual. But before we get to that, I have a list of 114 disclaimers that I need to read. Thankfully, it's not 114, but sometimes it feels like it to me. And this is, when I say disclaimers, it's a lot of explanations as to what we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it, expectations that we want to set, and even the usage of this type of information and sharing of it. So I'm going to kind of run through this, and I'll try to keep it under an hour and a half as part of this discussion here.
Should I go get a
John,
refill?
are you ready?
Yeah. I know I've got about a 10-minute break here.
Thankfully not. It's just a minute or, maybe 2 minutes,
All right.
but you can go refill that Jameson.
There you go. Go for it.
All right. So when we talk about this test information and we recap it for everybody, we are using public knowledge. There are places we can point to online where this has been put in place. We also use knowledge that we have collected over the years to kind of compare sections to look at difficulty. We have a massive archive of information on past tests that goes back decades at this point and allows us to say, hey, this section was used in 2008. This one was used in 2015. So it's not just public knowledge that we're using. It's the basis for what we do to make sure that what we're talking about is correct. But we also have a lot of private information and private reports about this. And that's how we're able to collate all this information and make predictions about scaling, for example, and sometimes to make predictions about what's real and what's not, which is exactly one of the things we're going to talk about. I will remind test takers that as they go through their test day, they may have the same section order as somebody else. That does not mean anything. I tweet this during every test right now. I'm like, just because you had RC second and fourth and another person you're talking to online had it second and fourth does not mean you had the same sections in those two places. You could have them reversed. That's very common, especially on this test. Sometimes it's totally different sections or only one overlaps. Section order is meaningless. Experimental can be first, second, third, or fourth on this test. So saying section order and then seeing someone else come in and be like, I had that same test. No, you don't know that. You need more information to determine if you had the same test. Sections and orders change all day long during the LSAT for every day they actually administer it. When we talk about information that's disclosed online, one of the things that we know is that LSAC allows test takers to disclose general information. You can talk about topic, what was this passage about, what was that game topic. What they don't want you to talk about are specifics. They don't want answer choices talked about, rules talked about, solutions talked about. They also don't want the experimental speculated about until the main testing is over. That's why we always wait until the paper and pencil test takers are done to release this, because it would have prejudicial information in it. When we talk about difficulty, one of the things that I will remind everybody is that our belief is that every LSAT is difficult. Every LSAT section is difficult. So when we talk about easier or harder, it's on a relative scale of high difficulty. If I say this logic game section is easier than this other one, I still think it's hard. It's just not as hard as that one. So don't make a relativistic flaw and think that easy means easy. It just means not as hard as these other sections. And remember also, there's a negativity bias when you take a real test. The pressure is on, you know that it counts. It almost always colors your perceptions afterwards in a negative way. We see this constantly. Some people say, this is the worst test I've ever taken, and they score a personal best. So keep that in mind when you look back and you're thinking, this was so much harder than this practice test, or this was the hardest RC section I ever saw. I'm sure that it felt that way when you're doing it, but probably in the grand schematic of things, it's unlikely you got the hardest RC of all time. It just felt tough because you were in the midst of that pressure cooker situation. So also, don't forget that the test makers are trying to confuse you. They are not your friends. They love to kind of throw sections out with similar topics, similar questions, so that when people are talking and they're all of a sudden like, yeah, I had the passage about speeding, or the question about speeding, or the passage about Nigeria, and you're like, I had that Nigerian passage as well, doesn't mean they were about the same parts of Nigeria. And that's a real world example. We've already seen that used. Speeding, music, all sorts of things where they're trying to confuse you. So when you're talking to other people or looking at what they said, you can't just use one or two words. You have to dig deeper. It's been happening for a while, and we know it's a tactic that they use. There's also estimations of what's real and experimental that we will make. They're based on certain assumptions, meaning that if a section has been used for sure as a scored section before, it will not then be used as an experimental section in the future. It doesn't affect this particular set of predictions and discussions, so we won't worry about it further. Also, you may not hear your section in our conversation. We think we got them all, but there are small subsets of test takers that are given sections that not many other people might have gotten. For example, there's a logic game section that was used on this test that not many people apparently saw. We know what it is. We know that it was real. We'll talk about it. But at the same time, it's possible that we could have missed something. If somebody's taken a bunch of LSATs before, they will not give you those same sections. And if you have overlap on something they were reusing, they will avoid it. So you might get a whole new section of the test. And coming down to the very end here, 2 final points. The first thing is that we ask that you not summarize this online. There are a lot of nuances to what we're saying. Sometimes we shade things one way or the other. This is a free podcast. We would just ask that you would say, go listen to the podcast. You can direct them right to the timestamp if you want, but we want people to hear it directly from us. In most of the recaps that I see, I'm like, well, that misses so much. It's frustrating to us. We want to be able to keep doing this in the future, and not having summaries put online helps us to do that. And then last but not least, these small tests, like this particular March test or this February test, when there's not too many people, is tough. It is very tough for us to track all of this information and collect the data. So to those of you who, posted online or wrote us and said, hey, I had, these 4 RC topics, we thank you for that. Every data point actually helps. But it does mean that it's harder for us to be able to say we got everything. We think we got it this time. We feel very comfortable with what we're talking about, as well as our difficulty predictions. But just be aware, small tests, greater variation, just because you don't have as much information. And now, 114 polemic points, and 2 hours later, I am done.
Nicely done. That was not long enough for me to go do much damage to the Jameson. So,
that's weak. You should have just hit it back. Gone for it.
I'll leave it on the desk next time. I won't have to go for it.
So let's get into it then.
Yeah.
After all that, all of it important, I think, to say, but if you've heard it before, you're like, whew. But if you haven't, it's kind of like, oh, there are some really good points that are in there. Let's talk about this March LSAT. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the style that we've kind of defaulted to recently. Instead of talking about the order in which things came out, we're going to talk about all the sections of each type. So starting on Friday morning, we know what we saw in logic games, but we're going to talk about all the logic games sections that we saw.
Yes.
And John, I will turn that over to you.
Oh, all right.
I need a break.
So yeah, let's begin with Friday morning. And what happened here right out of the gates honestly wasn't terribly surprising given what they did in February. In February, we saw them use a test partially for the reading comp specifically. And we mentioned in the crystal ball, and we'll come back to this, that test was still fair game because the reuse wasn't total. And sure enough, what they pulled out on Friday morning for games was another portion of that test. I'm referring specifically to October 2020. They used the reading comp from that test in February. They used the logic games from that test really all week.
Yeah, and let me just jump in and say these were the scored sections from October 2020, but they didn't release them to the public.
Yeah.
And so when they don't release them, they have the opportunity to reuse that content. This is why the non-released versus released test status is so important. All these flex tests, many of them at least, have gone unreleased, and so they keep coming back up. Any experimental from the past can be reused. Any February test that wasn't released in the past can be reused. So when John says, hey, they went back and they pulled out October 2020, yeah, they had never given anybody the logic games after administering it back then, so it was still fair game, and here we were.
Yeah, when people hear this reuse idea, their instinct is always outrage until they understand they're not reusing anything anyone could actually have a copy of. These are just tests that they've used, kept in the vault so they can dust them off and use them again. And they've been doing this for, literal decades. So yeah, this is nothing new, but specifically the games from that October 2020 test that we saw on Friday were these. There was a game about concerts and bands, I think with different acts, like an opening and a main act. A game about job interviews. There was a game in there about a bookstore and book signings. And then the one that I think is most recognizable for people was the last game, which was about operating machines and people, factory workers, basically trading machines back and forth. It was a shredder and a riveter and a press, I believe, were the three machines. And the reason I say that game stood out, as we will discuss, is that was easily the toughest game of the four.
Definitely.
Yeah. So that was the first set.
That's the first set of games that went through there. And I think, I think you and I have both heard this set described in similar ways, is that the first three games were doable, reasonable. No game, again, is easy, but those games were easy in comparison to the last game, which almost everybody felt was weird, strange, had outlier elements to it, saw it described in so many different ways that it was a bad way to end it. And I will say this way about logic games is that if you get the first three and they're not terrible, even if you do great on those, if the last game gets you, you move out of that section feeling really bad about it. That's just kind of the basic rule. If you end the game section in a panic or not being able to finish or feeling like I don't know what to do, the whole section is colored in a negative light, kind of like it just casts it backwards. And that's kind of, I think, the way this section felt for a number of people, is even if they did well in the first three and they were actually in a really good position going into that fourth, the fourth was frustrating.
Yeah, your final experience colors the whole thing more than anything else would. If you had seen that Machines game as the first game, I don't think anyone would have loved it. But I think the section as a whole would have felt differently in hindsight.
Yeah, we'll come back and maybe talk a little bit more about this game, but this game was not one that is unknown to us. I think it's a game that we actually know quite a bit about because they have tested it repeatedly throughout time. This game has appeared back on the February 2008 LSAT, in February 2011. It was given in February 2013 and June 2014, all in the experimental section. That is not unusual. If they have a game that they like, but they can't get it right, they'll keep giving it as an experimental as they tweak things until they finally get it to a point where now we like it. And now that they like it enough, it's becoming apparent that they will use it on real sections, and obviously in more than one case, because you saw it in October 2020 here, and now you're seeing it on this particular test.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? The first version of this game that we can track is over 13 years old, and they continue to amend and revise and tweak, as you say. And then from 2014 until 2020, it disappeared.
Yeah. Probably showed up on a few international exams, things like that. And it's actually 14 years ago that you had this show up, February 2022
now, isn't it?
You're caught in the 2021 limbo.
Yeah.
But there was, one of the things that we'd done in the Crystal Ball was recommend games that people go look at. And it's because we knew this one was floating around. And there are games in previous history that have some similar mechanics to what happened here. And those were in our Crystal Ball. So when people were, you talk about the predictions that we make there, it's not just about which tests we say they're going to predict. It's about the problem sets that we're suggesting. It is a very robust look that we had at it. We knew this game was possibly going to reappear, and we were trying to prepare people for that.
Yeah, there are released games that are similar enough that they would have given you an edge if you were familiar with them. We tried our best to make people familiar with them, specifically recommending those games. So there we are. I know I heard that from a lot of students. So thank goodness you told me to do game X, because it helped me here, which is obviously our entire point.
Yeah, and some people might say, well, that wasn't fair. I was like, well, we did it for free. We told
and for everyone.
Yeah, we did it for everybody. There was no cost to it. And remember, it's a standardized test. So the standards of what they're testing come up and up again. So, for example, flaws in the reasoning. We know that they're going to test certain flaws, and they're going to come up frequently. Is it wrong to say, go back and look at these questions because they contain this particular flaw? Of course not. Same thing with games. We do that on a broad scale when we know there's like a linear type of game or a grouping type of game where you need to know this. This game just has an odd mechanic to it. There are very select few games in prior history that also have a similar mechanic. We just happen to recommend, one that we thought would be a very close parallel. And so it was a happenstance that it occurred this way, but a very happy one.
Happy happenstance. Yeah. So those 4 games were real. We saw them used throughout the weekend, and that was the primary logic game set. The vast majority of people who tested here in March got those games. However, there was another set of real games floating around, 23 questions, and we know a little less about these in terms of the specifics and the details of topics, just because far fewer people got them. But if you saw any of the games that I'm about to mention on your test, they were real. Here's what they were. There was a game about bands on a stage. So to Dave's earlier point that they like to duplicate topics, both sets of games had a set on games with bands on a stage or concert performance sort of thing. We saw it in both sections here. The game that I think is the standout in this section, at least from identification, was about apple trees being planted in north and south fields. So again, if that rings a bell, this section was real, and we'll talk more about the difficulty of it near the end. There was a game, I believe in this, I don't think it was the bands on a stage, but it could have been, about 2 nightclubs. Some confusion as to whether or not that's the same game about bands and nightclubs or if they were different. And then a game in that same section about a teacher, a lecturer. I imagine giving lectures. So,
yeah, and clearly not as many people had taken this. So our data points on this were not as robust.
And we also couldn't track it as a reuse. So it's not like we would have heard about these previously. This seemed to be a brand new section.
Yeah, there are times when John and I are like, this is a section that is coming into use for the first time, or at least it hasn't been used very much before. So then we're really looking for a lot of information. There are other instances where we're like, we've seen this and we've seen it repeatedly, and now we almost know within seconds, we know everything about that section, and we just have to confirm that no changes were made. And typically, if a section has been used as scored before, they're not going to make changes. So the funny thing is, that's it. Those are the 2 logic games. Most people ended up with the first section, kind of like the machines one with the shredder and so forth. But a few people, definitely, I think a smaller group, had this one about the fields in the north and south. But that was it. Only 2 logic game sections, no experimentals.
I was about to say that.
Both of these counted.
Yep. For the savvy listeners out there who are wondering, so what about the experimental games? We didn't see any.
Yeah. And again, someone might be like, wait, I had 2 logic games on my test. And that's great. We never saw anybody who had that configuration either talking about it or reaching out to us. So you can call us later.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from you if you're the exception to this rule. And that includes the paper and pencil people. As we'll see, they didn't have experimental games either, as far as I could tell.
Yeah, and then that moves us over to reading comprehension. And this was, I think, the big point of confusion during the weekend. And you and I had a very strong feeling early on what was happening, because a lot of students, I'd say the vast, vast majority, ended up, in fact, maybe all of them,
not all aside from paper people, yeah.
Yeah, all aside from paper people, ended up with 2 reading comprehension sections. So everybody on Friday and Saturday was walking out saying, well, I know RC was experimental, but which one was it? And for a lot of people, that was a really important piece of information because they felt that one section was easier and the other section was harder. And for example, using my 2nd and 4th position example, I saw these sections in both 2 and in 4th. So sometimes, the one that we'll call the GMO that we'll get to in a second was 2nd. Sometimes it was 4th. This is where section order is completely useless. So some people would be like, well, I thought the first one was harder and I thought the second was harder. And I could tell they were talking about the same sections, but they just didn't realize the positioning, which we preach this every single time. And if you're taking the LSAT, you just have to know how this works because it helps uncloud the circumstances and the situation post-test. But let's get into the 2 sections, and then we'll talk about which one is real because we know for sure which one it is.
Yeah, we were able to confirm our suspicions. To expand on your point, though, about section placement, both of these sections of reading comp appeared in all 4 sections for people.
Yeah.
So
I was using 2 and 4 because I saw a lot of that early on.
Yeah, that seemed to be the Friday morning layout for sure.
Yep. So here we go. The first example of these sections had passages on the following topics. The Mayan civilization and theories about collapse, for example, was a drought that caused it. So that was a passage. Then you had one about GMOs, genetically modified organisms, that was out there. That was a comparative passage that had some real challenges to it. Then Samuel Beckett and play productions, which I saw all sorts of different kind of like descriptions of this particular passage. And then the last passage in there was about international IP, copyright law, and technology, kind of like an economic policy, a whole different set of like topics with a legal bent on it. So this was an interesting set, and I feel like most of the people who took this test, not all of them, but many of them said this was the harder of the 2 sections. So the GMOs, as we kind of referred to it all weekend, was the one where I saw the majority of people saying that was harder. They wanted this one to be experimental. So what was the other passage set that they ran into? Well, that was these 4 topics. Japanese video game translation and localization. I think that might have had personas in it as well. Another passage about judicial analysis and empirical theory. Sounds very abstract and challenging. One about kind of like burial sites and tombs and archaeology, like Scandinavian versus Egyptian sites and dig sites. That was the comparative. I heard some complaints about that. And then one that I don't want to ever read, but I'm sure I'll have to eventually, about innate numbers and kind of like an innate numerical sense versus an innate sense of space. You probably would like it, but it sounds to me like it's not my cup of tea.
I actually did some reading on it over the weekend for, I'm doing air quotes around fun, but for fun. I was really curious about this. I know a little bit about it, but I read a lot more.
Well, I don't know anything about it, and I don't want to know more about it.
I'll bore you over dinner one night.
Let's pass. And I think a lot of other people were like, they didn't want to learn about it either. But again, anytime you run into a reading comp topic where you're like, no, I don't want to deal with it, you have to say, what can I learn from it? And kind of like force happy yourself into dealing with it. But a lot of people liked that Japanese video game one because they're like, video games, that's fun. You can at least get into it. It's something to think about. And maybe because of the presence of that and a few other things, for a lot of people, this felt like the easier of the two. Now, if you're sitting out there and you're thinking, well, I thought that was the harder of the two, that's okay. The LSAT is about how it hits you individually. And just because other people think that this one was easier or the other one was harder doesn't mean that's what it was for you. You might have just crushed the GMO passage set and just felt great about all the topics, and maybe you didn't feel great about the topics here. So we're talking about volume and the overall perception of what we know about this. Now, the problem with this is that neither of these passage sets have been used as scored sections before. So it wasn't easy to determine which one was real. John and I knew early on that the GMO one and the Samuel Beckett one had been used back in June 2019 as experimental passages. Usually when you see something like that, you'd have to think to yourself that when it reoccurs a couple of years later, it's probably being used as real, especially when the other 4 in the other section, there's no record that we have of those in anything in the last like 15 years or so. They look like they're new, meaning they're being tested out along the lines of the first time. So our suspicion was coming out of the weekend that, that GMO, the harder of the two for most people, was going to be the real section. And then that was confirmed on Tuesday.
Yes.
The paper and pencil test takers, largely that we saw, had 2 logical reasoning sections, and they only had 1 reading comprehension section, and the GMO was that reading comprehension section, meaning it was real for them. And I think we can confirm with absolute comfort and certainty that GMO was real over the weekend as well.
Yeah, that sealed it for both of us. Again, running on the assumption that if it counts for one person, it counts for everyone. We know it was real for the paper and pencil people, the genetically modified crops and Beckett and the rest. So when you saw with the digital test over your weekend, when you saw both of these sections paired up, you now know which was real. And Dave mentioned the idea that some people thought the Japanese video game section was harder. That's the person to be, frankly, because the harder one for you then did not count. So in an ideal world, the experimental would be the one you didn't like.
Exactly. That's what you want to have occur. And I know a number of people were like, tell me which one was real. Tell me which one was real.
I got asked 200 or 300 times. That's not an exaggeration.
We got a bunch of instructor emails like, hey, can you shed light on it? We're like, no. Well, we can, but we're not going to. To a lot of people that we like and trust, but we're trying to not allow that information out, even if we are sitting on top of it, until after the test is done. And that's why we do this podcast, because then we can talk about all this stuff and enjoy it. Let's go to LR.
All right. This will be an easy one, finally. Because in the same way that we only saw 2 sections of games the entire time, never experimental, just 2 real sections of games, we saw 2 sets of reading comp, always as a pair, which means one was always experimental, the other real. We only saw, reported at least, 1 section of logical reasoning the entire time. I believe it was 25 questions. Don't hold me to that. But I can give you some topics that we know were real in logical reasoning. If you had a section that didn't match these, please reach out to us, because you would be the first that we have heard from with that. Here are some of the topics that we know counted in the section. Singular. that was real. It began, I believe, with a question about environmentalist cars, something about the energy needed to build electric cars and the cost of that versus the damage by non-electric cars, making a comparison there. Am I allowed to say the question type, Dave?
No.
Okay. It was unusual question type. I'll leave it at that. There was a question in that section about Einstein and relativity and the bending of light. I imagine this was like gravitational lensing or something. A question about food trucks and vendors in a town, speed of the Earth's rotation, question on gas tax and farmers, one about restaurants failing, a couple of biological questions, one about warm and cold-blooded animals that had to do with dinosaurs, and then another different question about the marine fossil record and carbon dioxide, leading to, I think, more mammals in the ocean. There was a question in there, also a bit biological, about blood glucose and different inputs and the processing of glucose and how it changed memory, increasing and improving memory. And then I believe the final question in that set was about judicial systems and their effectiveness.
Yeah, so that's largely what we saw people on Friday and Saturday getting as their sole section.
Not just largely, I think exclusively.
From what we heard and saw.
Yes.
Yeah. So everything that we saw was exclusively this section. That doesn't mean that it was the only one, because maybe somebody has taken a bunch of these LSATs, had that, and they're out there with a different section thinking that wasn't mine. You know, if you had one LR, it was scored. Mm-hmm. So you don't really need anyone else's opinion at that point other than your own to say, all right, this is what I thought about it. The paper and pencil test takers on Tuesday had this section as well. Yeah. So we know if you took it on Tuesday, this was your scored section of the two. We actually don't have a whole lot of information on the other LR section that the paper and pencil test takers had because there were so few of them. We just didn't really get much in the way of specifics. So we're still on the hunt for that, but right now we don't have that information. But that's it. You get down to the end of this kind of like overview. We have seen tests in the past have 36, 44, 56 different test forms, variations. I'm not talking about order. We're talking about actual content, possible variations.
Combinations.
This test has 2. And it all depends upon which logic game section you got. But it looks like the scored RC and the scored LR is the same for everybody. And I will say that this is an interesting moment because for about the last 2 years, I've been saying they're doing too many test forms. They're wasting too many sections because this is already hard to figure out. It's already confusing. People aren't really talking about this test online. You don't need to have 36 versions of it. And so it looks like they finally said, I guess we don't. Because 2 sections, you think, wow, everyone would know exactly what was going on as soon as the first test takers came out on Friday. Not at all.
No.
I didn't see anything that I thought was a prejudicial disclosure during the 2 days of discussion. They talked about topics. There was a lot of confusion over which one was real as far as RC and which one wasn't. But I didn't see anything where it was like, oh, now I have an advantage.
Yeah, especially when they only use a single experimental type, the same pair of reading comp. They did this with games back in February. Mm-hmm. Same exact thing.
Yeah, and if somebody's like, wait, I don't understand the mechanics of that, ask us offline because we can kind of explain it a little bit more. But if you've got a pair of sections, one of which is real and one is experimental, but there's no other confirmation during that test day or during that test week, you have to avail yourself of additional information. Like we have to go back in the archive and realize, hey, that was given as experimental. That's the way that we can figure that out and know it quite early. But they have dropped the number of forms they're using on the last 2 tests. I think that may be a feature. Do I think in June they're going to have 2 forms? No. They may have 4 or 8, but I wonder if the days of, say, 24 or 36 forms are gone because the cheating issue that they have doesn't relate to this.
Yeah. This is why I could get away with a shot of Jameson for every test option that was out there. There were only 2. I think if I try to keep that trend alive through June, you'll inherit a lot of nice watches, Dave.
I would like to do that. That would make me happy, but can we push that back a number of years?
Fair enough.
So the thing that we'll say is we think that's all the sections that were there. And again, anything that we missed is either a function of, kind of just not seeing the information or, towards Saturday afternoon, things really slowed down because people were like, I'm done with this. I don't want to, share anything about it or talk about it. And so it makes it tough on us to do that. But still, we're trying to find out all that information. And we do appreciate the data points that we were able to see and that were shared with us. So before we get to the matrix and talk about the scoring scale, which is obviously important, one of the things I said I'd circle back to was kind of like that crystal ball discussion.
Mhm.
Because they did something that we talked about in the crystal ball, and we said that it would make it much harder, and that was that they reused parts of October 2020. And one of the things I said in talking about test reuse is if they start doing partial reuses like this, it's going to be really, really difficult to pin them down. As many people who are listening right now know that we've been fortunate now on 5, 6, 7 occasions, I don't even know the count, to predict which non-disclosed tests that they would choose to reuse. We did it in February, for example. And so students who had kind of like gone back and listened to the podcast were able to say, hey, I felt comfortable with that when I got to it. When they do something like this, and we talked about it, it means the tests go back in play, and we can't really knock them off the list of possibility. It means they could go back to a test that we didn't think they were going to use and then start using parts of it if it suits them. I do think now, knowing that they've done this, that we still have the candidates that I had outlined in order in that March-April crystal ball as our primary reuse candidates for April. And because that list remains the same, that is why we're not going to do a crystal ball specifically for April. We feel like we've already done that. We will do it for June. I will say, though, that one of the things that I said in the Logic Games discussion was, outlier games don't come up a whole lot, but the chances are increasing. We do think we're going to see one. I don't know if we'll see one immediately or whether it's going to be 6 months from now, but we had changed our predicted problem sets, so the ones we wanted students to do, to add a few specific outliers. One of the games that we predicted that was very likely to come up from a mechanical standpoint did come up. And so I know you got a few messages that said I felt so much better having thought about that game. And like I said earlier, it's like I felt better having studied grouping. Every single game is fair kind of like territory for you to study and know. Ideas get reused constantly. Our job is to direct people to what we think the best material is to kind of like focus on. And I think we were successful with that again. So I felt pretty good about it. But
Yeah.
Anything to add there?
No, I feel really comfortable, not only with what we did for March. I definitely don't feel like we led anybody astray, but I think a lot of the points actually landed in the most helpful way possible. But I think it holds true for April, as you said. So if you haven't watched that and you're taking April, please go track that video down in your student center. If you're one of our students, become a student if you're not, because that video can do you a lot of good. Frankly, I know it saved a lot of people in March.
Come join us on the crusade.
Come join.
Let's get into the scoring matrix then. And I'll give a little kind of preface to this. And then, John, maybe I'll let you run through the actual matrix itself, and we'll talk about some of the nuances. I don't think this was the easiest matrix for us to make, but we've made it. And I think we're comfortable with where it lands, almost more in summary than in specific. But we'll talk about that. The way these scoring predictions work is that we look at the difficulty of the section based upon what we know about the test from students that we talk to, from instructors who have taken it, from historical information that we have. And as I've said previously, we have a huge database that really tracks all sorts of commentary about difficulty, content, and some of these sections we know a tremendous amount about. October 2020, that Logic Game section is one of them. So we feel pretty good about what it is that we're talking about. But when we look at this, we try to make predictions starting at the 170 point. How many questions could you miss to get a 170? And oftentimes, top-line difficulty translates or echoes throughout the scale. So if you have a really tight scale, you couldn't miss that many questions to get a 170. You'll see some tightness at 160 as well. Whereas if you have a really loose scale, meaning you could miss a lot of questions or more than normal questions to get a 170, you'll see that translate down as well into, say, 165, 160, and so on. So the matrix starts at you can miss 7 questions to get a 170. This is the average test. And then what we do is we talk about each section and say, if you had this section, it will have primarily one of 3 effects. It'll tighten the scale by 1, it'll keep the scale exactly where it is, kind of 0, or it'll loosen the scale by 1. And so we kind of do that on a binary thing. We're going to, mess around with that a little bit this time. And the last point I will make is that we are always conservative. So given the choice of being kind of like granting more looseness to the scale or keeping it tighter, we always choose to go tighter. And there's a simple reason for that. That gives you almost like the worst case scenario. And then if there is additional looseness, that just benefits the test taker. So Keep that in mind. That conservatism is actually built in by design and with intent into what we are doing. And then we'll talk a little bit at the end of this about the scores moving on down from 170, 165, 160, and 155 a little bit, just to give a broader range. It does loosen up as we go down. It's not as easy to predict as the top line difficulty at 170. So we give more of a range for those scores. So take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
John, all yours.
All mine, huh? All right. Well, this will be happily brief, I think. We always start, as Dave mentions, at -7 for 170. That's our baseline, and then we move it. It's fairly rare that we would go to -6. The test would have to be very, I don't want to say easy, but accessible relative to normal for us to tighten it up. Usually we start to loosen it, and then it's just a matter of how much, the impact of each section type on what that number might be. So starting at -7, let's talk about the only thing that had more than one section that was scored, which is logic games. 2 sections of logic games, as we mentioned. One had the concert with the opening and the main acts. It had the interviews, authors in the bookstore with the book signings, and then the machines with the press and the shredder and things. This was a tough section, the tougher of the two. But, and Dave alluded to this before, when you get a section with one standout game of high difficulty, like the machines, the shredder, but the other 3 are fairly straightforward, it tends to counteract and counterbalance itself. In other words, it tends to just equalize. I don't think this section on the whole was hard enough to move the scale. And Dave, I assume you agree with me on that.
I do agree with you.
Yeah.
Although I know a bunch of people just threw their glasses at the wall. This section, to me, I think what I described it to you as is like, it's so hard to do fractions on this, but to me, it's like a 0.33 or a 0.5 that it would loosen it. It was clearly more difficult than the other section from what we know about that. Did it move it by itself? No. In fact, I think all the difficulty in this is almost like 0.3 for each of these.
Yeah.
We'll kind of get to this and explain what we've done. But we'll leave it at 0. And before anybody gets too angry, there is an offset here that is coming that we will talk about where it all balances out. What about the other section about the north and south fields, the teacher, the lecturer, the bands on a stage, and so forth?
Yeah, the
How do you
apple
rate
trees.
that one?
This was the easier of the two by almost all reports, but I don't think it was easy enough to tighten the scale. What I can say with high confidence is that it was not difficult enough to loosen it. So this to me is definitely a 0. But again, if we're doing this fractionally, it might loosen it to like a 6.8, 6.7, tighten it to a 6.8, 6.7. In the same way that the other one might loosen it to like a 7.4. There's just no way to do this with decimals. So again, I think they're both 0 for these 2 sections of games.
Yeah, so if you're like, wait, this one was harder, we're not saying it wasn't. Or you're like, this was hard, we're not saying it wasn't. We're saying that we're trying to relatively place this. Let's go over to the RC and kind of throw this in here and the LR, and then we'll circle back to this logic game. So before anybody gets too mad, suspend judgment for a moment, and then we'll
pivot
return
to better news.
Yeah.
Let's talk RC. So this was the one about the Mayan civilization collapse, the genetically modified crops, Samuel Beckett, international IP law. This was a tough section. There were several passages in here that gave people fits. The comparative with the genetically modified crops I knew was tough. A lot of people struggled with Samuel Beckett and that play, his plaything. So this to me is going to loosen the scale. And again, since we're doing whole numbers, this would take it from a -7 to a -8, which is good news. This gives you an extra point, basically.
Yeah, so no matter which logic games, you're moving to -8. And again, we'll come back to it. Let's hit LR, and then we'll have all 3 sections in play that we can kind of balance out here.
Yeah. We're in a bad news sandwich, I'm afraid, because here comes LR. Again, I believe this was 25 questions, but this is the one about the environmentalist, electric cars, Einstein bending light, gas tax, blood glucose, memory. I think this one probably was not difficult enough to move the scale either. Fractionally, it's on the harder side of 0.
Yep.
But I don't think this is going to take your scale to a -9. So my estimation here is, regardless of games, reading comp, logical reasoning, everybody at this point I think is probably looking at a -8 for a 170.
Exactly. So no matter what you had in terms of the combination, you could miss 8 questions to get a 170. Now, let's come back in and kind of like temper this
Yes.
because it's really tough when we do this binary 0 or 1. Because I heard complaints about logical reasoning, especially in the first 10 questions. A lot of people noted this was more challenging than I expected. I found myself flagging more questions than normal. And you're not wrong, obviously. It's just that by itself, does it move the scale all the way down a whole notch? No. It's the same thing with those games. Certainly the one about the apple fields didn't. I'm very comfortable leaving that at 0 or even thinking it might tighten it. But also that press shredder section, that's not really a true 0. The way I kind of look at this set of kind of like sections is that really, for me, RC moves it about a half a point. But when you add the LR, that moves it about a third of a point. And then that hard logic games moves it about a third of a point. And so at that point, you're about -8. You're like minus 8.2. Playing a fractional game like that is incredibly challenging. And those fractions that we think in our mind but don't really disclose a lot of times, they then have an effect of loosening it downscale. Where when you hit 160, maybe it was going to be that you had to have 57 correct, but it might move it to 56 correct instead and give you an extra question there. That's where the fractional idea comes into play. It doesn't change anything at 170 because the expectation is, look, you're going to get most of the questions right at that level. But those high-level difficulty ones that they think a 170 might get, they might then say, well, that question is going to be missed by a 160, so you get looseness there. This is exactly why we're asking people not to summarize this online, because this is a nuanced discussion. If somebody just says it's 0, 1, and 0, it totally misses the kind of like contextual couching that we're doing here to explain that it's not that clear in this case. I think it adds up to -8 for a 170 for every single person, but you can see there's movement inside of it that's going to affect the scaling as you go down to, say, 160, 155, and so on.
Yeah.
You think that's fair?
I think that's very fair. Yeah, there's a real non-binary nature to this that the numbers betray if you're just looking at zeros and ones.
Yeah.
And that's
Sometimes
a
it's
very difficult thing to convey outside of a conversation like this, which is far more in-depth.
That's exactly right. And there are some tests where it really feels like, boy, the binary power is there.
Mhm.
This one did not feel that way. And that's okay. I mean, LSATs are different. They come in all sorts of different flavors. This one just has more of a nuanced shape. I feel like the entirety of how things add up gets us to this point, even if not each section says, oh, that's super hard. When you compare this test to, say, a lot of the January and February tests, in my opinion, this was an easier exam for many people. Not only did I hear that from people, from what I could see of the test, it certainly seemed that way. The reports that I was receiving kind of supplemented that. So it's kind of like, hey, nothing was killing me. I felt difficulty everywhere, and that certainly has an impact, but there was no kind of like nuclear strike on this test. And the shredder game may be close, but not enough to just completely blow up people's tests and end them.
Yeah, we
For
both
most
spoke
people,
to a lot
not
of people
everybody.
who had tested in January or February or both. And the consensus seemed to be that those tests both were harder than this test ultimately was. And those were both tests that we put more in the -9 kind of range. So I don't think this goes quite to that extreme. However, I'm going to throw out a bone, a generous bone. If we're wrong here, and again, we do try to get it right, but if we err conservatively. This wouldn't be a -7. This would be a -9. In my estimation, Dave may feel less generous.
No, I wouldn't say that. I think each part has incremental difficulty.
Yeah.
I think there's some hidden difficulty in the LR that is not. It's not loosening the scale. It's not tightening the scale. Rather, it's going to contribute more to loosening it. In the same way for each one of these sections. Maybe the Apple Fields one has a slight loosening effect, but it's so small as to be really negligible in terms of how it works. So I'm not even going to worry about that. For the sections that most people had, I definitely feel that it was -8, and I'm pretty comfortable with that. I don't think it's -7. I certainly don't think it's -6.
No.
I also don't think it's -9. So we get where we are.
Yeah, I'm with you. Apple Trees doesn't move it, in my opinion. The other three all would. It's just a matter of degree. Do they move it 0.3 or 0.6? That's your -8 or your -9.
All right, so -8 for everybody. That's easy enough. But how we got there is a tortured path, as they would say.
Yes,
Given the fact that everybody had that -8, Let's just do some broader based summaries for what it would probably look like for 165, 160, and 155.
Sure.
Why don't you run through those and then we'll wrap it up here.
Yeah, people always ask a little further down the scale, so let me see if I can give you some predictions there. For those 3 target outcomes, 165, 160, 155. And I'm doing this predicated on the, I think, fairly safe assumption that LR was 25 questions. So 75 questions total scored. If that's the case for this -8 test, I would expect a 165 to be a -13, which means you'd need to get 62 questions right. For a 160, I would anticipate this was about a -19 type of scale. It's about 56 questions correct for 160. And a 155, -28. So you'd need 47 right out of 75 for 155. That's how I think the scale would look further down. But it's harder, again, disclaimer, it's tougher for us to nail those numbers because far more variables are in play for people at a 155 than at a 170.
You think it's possible like 160 could be like -20 and
Sure.
155 could be like -29? That's where we might see some of that fractional concept that we were talking about pay forward at those levels. And so that's where that range is a little bit more. When I look at 160, you and I are talking about it, we don't get the same distinct feeling because mid-range difficulty, which is the type of questions that affect 150s and 160s in terms of scoring, a lot harder for us to see. The stuff that's really difficult, very easy for us to see post-test to understand. That's what gives us the 170 prediction, which is so much more solid than these. But that hopefully gives scorers at any range a pretty comfortable idea of what they would be looking at to achieve those particular results. And again, it's all based upon the number of questions missed to get those scores. Starts at -7 to get a 170, and then this test moves it to -8 for everybody. And as John said, missed 13 for a 165, missed 19, maybe 20 for a 160, and then maybe 28 or 29 you could miss to get a 155.
Yeah. The reason it's tougher near the middle, we're almost out. I've always got one more thing.
You do.
Our old Apple demo. The reason it's tougher is things hit differently at different scoring levels. That game about the shredder, a 170 person, especially one who is maybe well-versed in some of the recommended content, isn't going to be nearly as badly affected by a game like that as, say, a 155 who's never seen anything like it. That could be just a complete, zero
meltdown
for a 155. Yeah. That was 5 or 6 questions of consequence. A 170, it might have cost him 1 point as opposed to the normal 0. So it's a very different type of impact that difficulty has. And that's why, again, we try to shade things as we move to the middle.
Yeah. And again, as I said before, that nuance is why we really appreciate people being just directed to the podcast to listen to this, because it's not, I think, in this case, fair at all for people to think, oh, it's everybody's -8. Fine. There's much more to this. And again, scores come out on Wednesday, March 30th at 9 a.m. So be around for that. Get your score. Hopefully you've done fantastically well. And let us know how things actually turned out. But that's the full discussion of the March 2022 LSAT. Hopefully you found that interesting. If there's anything that you feel like, oh, you missed this or you don't have this information, send it to us. Let us know what that is. We're always happy to talk about it. But on that particular note, we'll close it out. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment and a rating as well. And we'll be doing a mailbag podcast, I think probably in the next month or so. So please send us questions to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. Happy to talk about that. Anything under the LSAT sun, in the admission sphere, scholarship reconsideration and negotiation, all those topics are fair game. We're happy to talk about those. But on behalf of John and myself, we hope you enjoyed it. We hope you've actually found it useful. And again, send us questions if you have any of those. Stay safe out there and take care.